Hi, welcome to Let's Start Playing. Here I've got Dune War for Arrakis loaded up and ready to go in Tabletop Simulator. You can see I've got the map opened up. I'm just going to explain that the map's divided into 8 different sections with these lines along here dividing like the quarters of the map. So there's a section here, 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 here. On each section there are these white circles and these are like flight zones. This is where the Harkonnen player is going to be able to place their ships. And their ships will be able to access the adjacent areas to these flight zones. I'll quickly just mention the areas on the map as well. So we've got desert spaces, which are these outside ones around here. There's also deep desert areas, which are the desert spaces on the border of the map. They are qualified as deep desert. We have the plateau area up here. So all these cities are on the plateau area. We have mountainous areas, which are this area around all these cities and in the middle here. We also have the minor Urung section, which I'm not sure if I'm saying right, but that's this area just here. And this is also plateau area along here. I'm just going to quickly go over the setup for both players. The Tabletop Simulator mod that Cool Minis or Not have released has this convenient little button that you can press here, and this will complete the setup for each player when you click it. So for the Atreides player, they'll get stitches and all the stitch tokens on the map. These are all predefined. They'll also get 1 garrison token, which will have a random amount of units at the bottom and a random selection of units, and 1 leader in each one of their areas. So that's these leaders here. So they have 8 bases out on the map straight away. And these bases all have a value on the bottom that is randomly distributed at the start. For the Harkonnen player, we can do the same thing. We can go over here and click their setup. And they'll get a random selection of troops in each one of their settlement areas, which is just coming out now. These are decided by tokens in the physical version. These settlements, however, are static, so these are all predefined and they will have a strength as well on the bottom. With the stitches, these are a hidden number and a hidden amount of strength and also a hidden number of victory points for the Harkonnen player to capture, which I'll go into more detail soon. Also, as part of the setup, each player got their starting leaders placed out on their action boards over here. The Atreides player also is given a secret objective, which is this here, and this is what they'll need to achieve to win the game. For the Harkonnen player, they get their starting leaders out, and they also have access to this Spice Must Flows board, which I'll go into more detail soon. So let's talk about the victory tracks. For the Atreides player, they have 3 tokens on this track. They have a green, red, and yellow. And these tokens have to reach these numbered spots on the track. So that is 10 for green, 3 for yellow, and 5 for red. So they would win if they get into this configuration. The game would end and they would win. For the Harkonnen player, things are a bit simpler. They have a track numbered 1 to 10 here. And each time they destroy one of the stitches that the Atreides player has, they'll flip the token and find out how strong it is and how many points they earn. In this case, it would be 1. I believe these are numbered 1 to 3. Let's talk briefly about the player boards for each player. So over here on the Atreides side, when you're using your action dice that get placed here, we have a Regeneration Tank, which is when your important leaders die, they'll get placed in here. And over a number of rounds, they'll be able to be placed back out onto the board. They also have these spots here, and this is where the dice are placed based on the symbol that is rolled into the appropriate spot. And these are the actions that you can take with those dice. Things are more or less the same over here. They have the used action dice, Regeneration Tank, and matching actions along here. They also have this Spice Must Flows board, and this will track their alliances with the 3 different guilds. They need to maintain guild relations by giving them spice each round, and if they go down, they'll suffer less action dice and other penalties. I'll explain this more when we discuss this phase. Let's go over what a typical round looks like for both players. Step 1 of a round is to both draw 2 cards from both of these decks. The Harkonnen player has a Harkonnen planning deck and a Corino planning deck. And these will give you different abilities that you can activate on your turn. Let's have a little look down here. So you can activate these by spending 1 action dice. Doesn't matter what type of action dice it is. And these will have abilities on them. This lets you deploy units. And this one lets you reveal Wormsign tokens on the board to find out if there's Sandworms there. The Atreides player will do the same thing, but with their 2 cards. Let's jump over there. So we draw 1 from the top of each deck. This one is the voice. Discard any unused opponent action die, then draw 2 planning cards. And this moves a legion up to 3 desert areas. A legion is a group of units. These cards will be hidden from each other, so they'll be hidden in your hand, and you can have a max of 6 between rounds. The next step is to draw pre-science cards, and this is how the Atreides player will earn most of their victory points. We come over here and flip the top 3 cards of this deck. There's a total of 16 pre-science cards in this deck. And if you see here, we can see that these numbers in the middle here will raise the track, matching the color, up that many spaces. This would raise the green track up 3 spots if they completed this requirement at the bottom here. So this lets you sacrifice Paul and put him in the regeneration tank, and you'd get 3 victory points. And you can see these 2 cards offer different ways of gaining points. In the next phase, we focus on the Spice Must Flows board. This is where we'll check what faction has the lowest marker. So let's say this one's down here and these 2 are up top. We'll focus on which faction is lowest. So it goes from this is lowest to top. So if we look along the lowest faction, this indicates the amount of dice, action dice, that we lose in the next round. So we will take away 2 dice, 2 less dice for the action round. We would be able to get 5 harvesters on the board, 2 ornithopters, and 1 carryall. So the harvesters, when they come out, these are how the Harkonnen player generates spice, and would place 5 out on the board. They have to be placed on desert spaces, so let's go ahead and do that quickly. So harvesters would generate the Harkonnen player 1 spice at the end of the round, or they'll generate 2 spice if they're on a deep desert location. Next we have Ornithopters, and they are these tokens here. What Ornithopters let you do, when you're moving troops, you can discard them from these spots in order to move an additional spot and ignore 1 piece of terrain. So if I wanted to use an Ornithopter to travel over here, we would get these troops and move them over to this side, and this would then get discarded. So it's a way for the Harkonnen player to move around faster and also move over items, so they can move over sandworms or move over armies or impassable terrain. Another thing the Ornithopter can do is you can consume it in order to flip a stitch token and find out the value. We also get to put out 1 carryall. And how carryalls work is at the end of the round, all these harvesters will attract the attention of a sandworm, and a sandworm token will be placed in each of these spots. We'll flip the sandworm token, and if a sandworm attacks, the carryall can save the harvesters long enough so it's able to generate spice for the Harkonnen. It will still get destroyed at the end of the round. Next, both players will simultaneously roll their action dice and assign them to their action spots on their board. So let's have a roll of these, and these would slot into their locations, and the Harkonnen player would do the same. Next, the action round begins. I'll talk you through each of the actions both players can do. Some of them are the same, so I'll focus on the ones only different when I go to the Harkonnen side. So the first action here we have is leadership. And I'll quickly explain that because we have a character here, Paul Atreides, he can buff 1 of these action dice with a special choice here, but there is a default option below. And once you use your leader action card once, they get put aside until the next round, in which case they'll come back to their action spot. The default leadership moves are move 2 different legions with a leader, or make a surprise attack with a legion with a leader. Let's talk about moving. So I'll come over to the board and we'll flip 1 of these garrison tokens. This is something the Atreides player can do at any time to reveal the units underneath. Here we've got 1 basic unit. You can tell by the bases that this is circles, so this is a standard unit. I'll go into what different units are, but we have units and we have leaders. And there's a slight difference, but together they're called a legion. Now to move units, they can simply move 1 region adjacent to them. That's the basic move. Each legion can only move once on a turn, so when this says move 2 different legions with a leader, that means this legion cannot possibly move again, or these units cannot possibly move again. I'll be able to grab another legion, and these garrison tokens don't need to be flipped over in order to move, and they count towards the 6 limit cap, which there is a limit of 6 units not including leaders in each group. The Atreides have a special movement option, and this resolves around Sandworms and Sandworm tokens. The Atreides has a special option to place Sandworm tokens out on the board. I'll place a couple out and I'll show you how these affect movement. Let's say the board looks like this. There's a Wormsign token here and a Wormsign token here and a Sandworm that's been revealed here. The Atreides player can do something called sand riding. So that enables them to move a legion and move them across the sands to an adjacent spot like this. So there has to be a path of Wormsign tokens and Sandworms, and they can travel all the way along that path and come out one space adjacent on the other end. So if I had 2 leader movements, I could move him like that, and this one could move like across like this, down here, and that would be a valid move. Alternatively, if we put these back, and if there were some troops here, I'm allowed to do 1 attack in this leader movement, and I could, instead of moving 2 legions, I could attack with 1. And you can attack using the sand riding action as an attack. So that would put me in there and a battle would begin. If there was an enemy legion in this Sandworm token area and I tried to do sand riding, I would have to stop at the legion. I can't sand ride past them. Now that we're focused on the movement action, we have to talk about the attacking action as well. So let's add these 2 tokens over here. And let's just pretend that I did this Sand Riders action and I've entered a combat over here. First thing we need to do is flip the Garrison token and reveal what unit this Atreides player actually has. This is hidden to the Harkonnen player, but the Atreides player is free to check at any time. So I'll add these 2 units to the battle. This says a regular unit, and this is a symbol for the elite unit, this one here. With units, there are 2 different types, or 3 different types, but 2 subcategories, which is regular and elite. With the elite units, there's standard elite, and there are Fredekin for the Atreides. Fredekin add an additional combat bonus, so they lower the defense of the opponent by 1. With the elites, if they die, they get turned into regular troops. Let's jump over here and look at this combat. First thing we need to check is if I did a surprise attack or not. And because I did this attack action with the leadership action, it would be deemed a surprise attack. The first step of the battle is both players have an opportunity to discard planning cards from their hand in order to get additional combat dice. The bonus of the surprise attack is that my opponent doesn't get the opportunity to do this. In combat, you can only have a max of 6 dice. I'm going to say that the Atreides player has discarded both of their planning cards and have buffed their attack by 2. So they have 2 units and they have discarded 2 cards, so they get 4 dice. The leader does not count. The Harkonnen player will get 3 dice. I've brought the dice for both players over here, and let's just pretend I've rolled this result. Resolution in combat is quite simple. We add up the amount of attacks each player has, which are these swords. So it's 2 to 1. We add the defense that both players have, so 1 to 1. And these are specials, and these will only activate if you have leaders in the combat, and each leader can only activate 1 special dice. So I have a regular leader here, so if I jump over to his card, just over here, so this is the generic leader, and his card says for each special I roll, I get 1 attack. Your character leaders have different things on them, so Lady Jessica gets 1 defense for each special, and this person gets 2 attack. Back over to the dice here, we can count this special as an attack, so it's 3 attack, and because the Harkonnen player does not have a leader, they do not activate this special dice. Now for resolution, we have 3 attacks for the Atreides versus 1 of Harkonnen, so they have to lose 2 units. When you destroy a unit, you either have to destroy 1 regular unit or downgrade an elite to a regular unit. So in this case, let's say they destroy the regular unit and they downgrade their Harkonnen elite down to a normal regular unit. So in that case, we can just remove the elite unit. Now for the Harkonnen player, they have 1 attack dice versus 1 defense. So this would normally do no damage. However, they have their special Sardaukar unit here, which is like that upgraded elite. And this lowers the defense of the Atreides player by 1, so they would get 1 damage through. The Atreides player can destroy the regular unit, downgrade the elite, or lose the leader. So let's say they lose the leader. The Atreides player has a chance to cease the attack. And when I started this combat, these units shouldn't have actually moved into this location already. So I'm just going to reset that. So if you decide to cease the attack, you stay where you are, and the combat ends. If they do not cease the attack, combat continues, and then the Harkonnen player has a chance to retreat. They can retreat to any adjacent region as long as it's considered free, and that's a region with no one in it or with only your units inside. Locations on the borders with only harvesters in them are considered as free locations as well. In this case, if the Harkonnen did retreat, these two characters would have to move into this space. This doesn't occur if the attack was adjacent. So let's say I attacked from here to here and these two characters have retreated. I would not have to move into here, but because I use sand riding in order to get to this location, I am forced to move those units into that location as well. If these units did not decide to retreat, we would just initiate a second round of combat starting from the start. I'll quickly touch on settlement combat as well. So let's look at this settlement here. Settlement and stitches work the same. However, stitches are hidden information of how strong they're going to be. And we'll move these two units into here. So with settlement combat, the settlement themselves will add 1 combat dice. There's still a limit though of 6, which is the unit limit that you can have. So each player only has access to 6 combat dice, and every round the most you can roll is 6. If all the defending players' units are destroyed, the settlement is also destroyed. The benefit of destroying settlements for the Atreides player is that they get to raise all of their pre-science tracks by the amount of strength the settlement is. So in this case, that will go up by 1. But if you were to take out Arrakis over here, you'd get 3 on all tracks. If there was a named leader in this combat, let's pretend Paul was in this combat and he was to die, he would get sent to the regeneration tank over here. If there was already a leader in that spot, he would actually push the leader along and then slot into the end spot. So it actually speeds up the regeneration of existing dead leaders if you have a really terrible round. All right, that action was a big one. Next action we have is strategy here. And this lets you move legions and attack with legions. So very much the same as leadership. So I've already covered everything here. Next action we have is deployment. And this is different for both players. For the Atreides player, they get to place deployment tokens onto the board. And they have to go into the stitch locations. Deployment tokens get drawn randomly and you put them out. These deployment tokens are limited, however, and there's only a total of 8 in the pool. So once these are revealed, these do not go back in the bag. They will get discarded from the game. So the number of troops for the Atreides player is limited. You can also place a leader as according to this card here, deployment token and 1 leader. So I could put this into the same location, which is this stitch. Deployment tokens will all have an amount of units on the back of them that you'll get. So this would give you 1 regular elite and 1 Fredekin elite into that location when you decide to reveal it. You don't have to reveal these until either a combat occurs or you wish to reveal them. And remember that these count towards 1 of the 6 unit limit. Next action here we have is Mentat, and this lets you draw planning cards. You can draw from the same deck or different decks. You can have a max of 6 planning cards at the end of the round. And this house action lets you use any other action as its result. So that's pretty simple. You could use any of these other ones. Remember also that all these action dice can be used to play cards from your hand and do various things. For the Atreides player only, they also have an action called Desert Power. And you can only take this action if you have fewer unused action dice than your opponent. This action lets you do one of 2 things. So anytime you see this line dividing, that means you can only take 1 of the 2 actions. You can either place 2 Wormsign tokens or activate 2 Sandworms. Placing Wormsign tokens is pretty simple. You grab a random Wormsign token and place it onto any spot on the board. Activating Sandworms is slightly different. There are already active Sandworms on the board. You can move them around and control them. When you activate a Sandworm, you can move it up to 2 desert spaces. So this worm could move 1, 2. If a Sandworm comes into the same space as a harvester, it is immediately destroyed. The Sandworm is also destroyed. Let's pretend these units are here and the Sandworm moved into this space. An attack would happen. The Sandworm would roll dice equal to this chart over here. So if we look over here, Sandworm in Desert gets 4 dice. So they would roll 4 dice, and for every sword and special rolled on those dice, it would do 1 damage to this group of units here. Once the battle has concluded, I believe the Sandworm token is discarded, but this may have to be checked. I cannot find an exact clarification for this in the rulebook. I know if there's a harvester in the area, the Sandworm definitely gets discarded. The Atreides player can move 2 Sandworms when they do the Sandworm action if there are 2 present on the board, and they can both perform attack actions. So that rounds out all the Atreides actions. Let's have a look at the Harkonnen actions and the ones that are different. So most of these actions are the same. This one, leadership, lets you move with leaders in areas and attack. Strategy is also the same, move legions and attack with a legion. Legions are groups of troops and leaders. Deployment is slightly different. Instead of putting out tokens, they just get to deploy regular units and one leader in one or more settlements of their choice. It's pretty self-explanatory. Settlements are the cities that Harkonnens control at the start of the game. Mentat lets them draw 2 planning cards. Again, this can be from either deck or both from the same deck. They also have House, which lets them replace regular units on the board with 2 elite units. Or they can place another Ornithopter, Harvester, and Carriel on the board. With Ornithopters, Harvesters, and Carriels, they all have to occupy airspaces, and airspaces can only have a max of 1 unit inside. Just like Atreides, they can spend any of their dice on these spots to play cards from their hand. During the action phase, dice will be spent one at a time in alternating order, so the Atreides will go first, followed by the Harkonnen spending 1 action dice, then the Atreides will spend an action dice, and continue on like that. Once both players have spent all of their dice, we move on to the Desert Hazards phase. In this phase, Sandworms will come out at every Harvester location. These Wormsign tokens will appear if the Harvest is still on the board and hasn't been destroyed by the Atreides player before this phase, and we'll flip every single Wormsign token on the board, even those placed by the Atreides player, but using the Desert Power action. Next, we check the result of all of these tokens. So if there's a Wormsign token in the desert with nothing in it, we remove the token and replace it with a Sandworm. If you run out of Sandworms, then you can just grab any Sandworm on the board and move it to this location. Do these 2. This Wormsign token just shows desert. This is a blank, nothing happens. This one here shows like a mound of a worm sign beginning to appear. These will only trigger worms if they're on a deep desert space. If not, they can be ignored, but this one is. So this will trigger a sandworm to appear. If there were units in here of the Harkonnen player, a battle would occur and you'd roll dice from the sandworm, see if you destroyed all the units. If all the units were destroyed, the Harvester would get destroyed as well. If all the units weren't destroyed, the Harvester would remain. In this case, however, because there are no units, the Harvester gets destroyed and no Sandworm appears. Navigating the desert of Arrakis is dangerous for the Harkonnen player. If they're ever in a desert location or plateau location, they need to roll for If they're in a desert or plateau location, they need to roll for storms and see if the storms eliminate any of their units. There's a chart over here, Corylus Storm, I believe it's called. And if you're in the deep desert, you roll 3 dice. In the normal desert, you roll 2 dice. Or in a minor urn or plateau, you would roll 1 dice. Hits are achieved on special results and on dagger results. Next, we move on to spiced harvesting phase. So in this phase, all of the harvesters left on the board will generate spice. The amount of spice is 1 for each harvester, or 2 if they're on a deep desert space. So in this case, the Harkonnen player would have generated 4 spice. They then need to spend that spice. And to spend spice, they spend it on keeping their guild friends happy. So they can either spend 2 spice in order to keep the token exactly where it is. You can spend 3 spice in order to raise a token. Or if you, let's say I spent 3 spice this round and I had 1 leftover spice, I would put the spice reserve token into this spot here. This is the spice reserve token here. So this would come over here. You can only reserve a max of 1 spice between rounds. For every guild that did not either pay to stay still or to raise, they'll go down 1 rank. If they ever reach the bottom rank, they will inflict an Imperium ban on you. And these are bad things. So let's say the Lestrade Imperium have inflicted an Imperium ban. We'd find the Lestrade card over here. And this says the forms must be obeyed. Your hand limit is reduced to 3 cards. It's also an effect in a 3 to 4 player game. However, I'm not explaining the full 3 to 4 player game rules. You can find them in the back of the rulebook. Once we've completed the spice must flow phase, we'll then need to go to cleanup phase. So there's a summary of it over here. And we have to remove all Ornithopters and Carriels from the board. So at this stage, if you haven't used an Ornithopter for either moving troops or scouting yet, you're allowed to use it at the end of the round here to immediately scout somewhere. And you can remove it and scout that location. Then both players, starting with the Harkonnen, can replace any named leaders on the board with generic ones. Players then get to refresh all leader cards. So when you're spending action dice, you can spend them on these leader cards. You can then put them back onto your board ready for the next round. You can't use leader cards, however, if they are in the regeneration tank. So if the matching figure is in the regeneration tank, the ability is unavailable until they have revived. Both players have to discard down to 6 planning cards. Then the Atreides player can discard or shuffle these cards back into the deck. Something I haven't explained is that the Atreides player can only achieve 2 of these per round. So let's say the Atreides player did this during the round. This last card, the Atreides player could either discard from the game or shuffle back into this deck. I'll just come over to the pre-science track and explain that in a little more detail. So on this track, there are symbols at the 3, 6, and 8 mark. Certain events will happen when certain tokens get to these marks. If any of the 3 tokens get to here, the red, the green, or the yellow, you'll get to bring in these various leaders. There's a certain leader that comes in only when you get to 6 as well. And at 8, you get to do something called the family atomics. And what this involves is changing the map. So over here we have 3 terrain tiles, and these go into certain locations on the board. They change the mountains on top of them into desert spaces. And you'll get to do this when any of the tokens reach the 8th step of the track. So you could technically get all 3 out if you got them all up to 8. I believe some of these planning cards also allow you to place these earlier. In regard to these 3 leaders, 2 of these are upgrades for both Paul and Jessica. So they will replace the card on the board when you get them. Some of the planning cards you receive are also Bene Gesserit planning cards, which will have this symbol here. Instead of using this card normally, you can choose to discard this card in order to change one of your dice results to a different one. During movement, if the Atreides player runs into one of these ecological testing stations on the board, these are like leftover remnants of Harkonnen's previous rule, they will get to flip this token and go up on the track matching the symbol on the back. If it shows all 3, you'll get to pick one of the available results. Once you've completed the end of round, player would then begin again, starting with the start of round. So both players drawing 2 cards, and just follow along the left hand side of this helpful sheet here. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you did enjoy this, please like and subscribe. I hope you do get the chance to play Dune War for Arrakis soon, either in the physical copy once the Kickstarter arrives, or on Tabletop Simulator like this. Thanks again.